Thank you for joining us for the first in a series of webinars hosted by Partners Against Mortality and Epilepsy, or PAME. My name is Tom Stanton, and I am a member of the PAME Leadership Committee, along with Gardner Lapham, Dr. Elizabeth Donner, Dr. Jeff Buchhalter, and Dr. George Richardson. When we thought about the many mortality-related topics we could cover, we felt it was important to start with a conversation about the most challenging and heartbreaking scenario for any family in the epilepsy community, the experience of grief after losing a loved one. Before we begin, I want to extend special thanks to Anne Gramiak from the American Epilepsy Society for her diligent work planning today's webinar and for being an overall wonderful teammate to the PAME effort. So thanks, Anne. To give some context, I entered into the epilepsy community after my nephew Danny died from SUDEP at age 4. He would have turned 16 years old today. So the arc of grief for Danny's parents, siblings, and extended family has covered 11 years. I now advocate for a Chicago-based organization called the Danny Did Foundation, and I'm grateful for the chance to learn from other families today about their own experiences over time. I want to make one note at the outset in terms of the scope of today's discussion. Ahead of the webinar, we received a number of important questions related to SUDEP risk factors, sudden death registries, the causes of SUDEP, and about other types of epilepsy-related mortality. All of those questions are critically important. But today, due to time limitations, our focus will be on the grief process that comes after an occurrence of SUDEP. We do intend to talk about SUDEP more broadly during a future webinar. Until then, we encourage everyone to visit the websites of the Epilepsy Foundation, the Danny Did Foundation, the American Epilepsy Society for SUDEP and mortality-related information. Next slide, Ann. To give a brief overview of today's program, we will begin with insights into the arc of grief from Dr. Sarah Friebert of Akron Children's Hospital. Then we will transition to Dr. Jeff Buchhalter to hear about results from a survey that went to bereaved families to gain feedback on their grief experiences. And after that, we will have a panel discussion featuring both parents who have lost a loved one and professionals from the epilepsy community. As a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and shared on the PAME website, which is pameonline.org, and we hope that you will encourage others to watch. During our discussion, please feel free to submit a question through the questions box on your screen, and we will try to address as many of them as we can. Again, we request that you focus your questions for today on the grief experience, or about how to best support those who have experienced loss. And now we are fortunate to welcome Dr. Sarah Friebert for her overview on grief.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I am the director of a palliative care program at Akron Children's Hospital, so I am neither a neurologist or neurology professional nor someone who has lost someone to SUDEP, but I am someone who has had the honor and privilege of working with many families going through the grief experience from epilepsy, SUDEP, and other neurologic issues. And it's my privilege to be here with you today. The slides I'm going to show today are more numerous than we have time for, and there's a PDF that you'll receive as part of the resources because I just really wanted folks to have enough information as a starting point. So we won't cover the information in every slide, but it will be available for you as we go on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the arc of grief. It's been mentioned as a term, and just to remind people that the arc is kind of an actual celestial pattern that goes from one end to another, and that may or may not reflect your experience. I will say it may reflect how others see your grief, where there's somewhat of a beginning and then an end, where you're kind of supposed to go over this arc and then you're supposed to be over it at the end of that. There's a peak in that arc. It's not a straight line down, because most people experience that the grief actually increases at first because there's a shock period where you may not be feeling quite as much. And then after that wears off, the grief may decrease over time. That may not be your experience, and your experience may be one that looks more like this. And the question really comes up about how much time are you allotted for this process? What do others give you, and how can we help you along? Most people who are not going through the grief experience expect that you will be over it in 6 months, and this can be very frustrating for families. Because I think that from what I've learned, what it really feels like is more like this, where you're headed up a huge mountain, you can't see over the top, it feels unending, and then when you get over it, what you see are more mountains. Not a nice valley below where the journey's over, but more mountains to climb and more stress to go through. For others, it may feel more like this, where it's just continuous waves, and you think you've cleared one wave, you've stood up when it knocked you down. Lo and behold, another one comes right behind it. So making your way through that journey can be really challenging over time. I have a number of quotes and pictures in the presentation, and they by no means sum up everyone's experience. But one of the things I wanted to point out here is that really everything that we talk about doesn't substitute for bringing back the lost person, which is really the only thing that sometimes feels like it will be the answer. And it's also a difficult journey for those who witness those going through grief. So family members, friends, community folks who are trying to help feel very helpless because we are impotent. So I think that's a really important quote. It's also important to realize that the death is not necessarily the beginning of the process. For many families who are diagnosed with something potentially life-threatening or devastating, there's a grieving process that starts before. It doesn't go through predictable stages. It's not orderly. And what it involves is a series of work efforts that you have to go into to lean into the pain. And that in fact, we never get over our grief, but we learn to live with the loss. This is an interesting thing that recently came to my attention on Facebook, and I've been going through this with some families that I work with, and they've found that it resonates for them. So I just wanted to share it. This idea that of the ball in the box. So there's this huge ball in the beginning of your grief journey, and it's in a box, and you can't move the box that's your life without the ball hitting this button on the side that is hitting a pain button. So the box rattles around and the button is being hit constantly by your huge grief. You can't control it, and sometimes it seems unrelenting. And this was drawn by someone going through the acute grief process. Over time, what happens is that the ball gets smaller. So the ball is still there, your grief is still there, the loss is still there, but it doesn't hit the button as often. Unfortunately, it does randomly hit that button sometimes when you least expect it. So again, that idea of the ocean wave hitting you. There are also a number of helpful perspectives out there that I'm sure you've heard or you may hear. But just to recognize that grief is a normal part of the journey. And unfortunately, because we love people and loss is inevitable, it's sort of part of the deal, as C.S. Lewis says. But it's our opportunity to make meaning out of it, which helps the grief journey, and that's where we can find the healing. There are lots of terms that are thrown around, and I put this slide in just to clarify some of the definitions because I think people use these words interchangeably and they're not always. So grief is your inner response to the loss of a person you loved, and the mourning is the process of showing that grief to the outside world. The bereavement experience is what happens to you as a whole as you feel torn apart and your life is broken, and each person will go through this uniquely. Grief is very unique. It's unique for a million different reasons, and these are just a few of the things that affect people's responses. It's important to just know that there's no right or wrong response, and where you are in your life and where you go in your life will be very different. And if you've lost a child to SUDEP and that child has brothers and sisters, those brothers and sisters will go through grief at different developmental times in their lives that will look different. And parents, moms and dads, and other people in the family go through different grief experiences as well. So just important to recognize there's no right or wrong, and that the acute grief experience is one that's very selfish. It's very personal, and it's really hard for others to understand. There are a lot of myths out there about grief. I'm going to show 6 of them really quickly, just to remind you that we don't just grieve the death of the person that we lost. We grieve a lot of losses. And for many of you who have been on a chronic illness journey or a severe illness journey, you know that there are a lot of roles along the way or other things that you can lose. And if you're a person who has epilepsy or a significant neurologic condition, you know that you might be grieving what you thought your life would look like, a normal childhood, a normal life. So it's a spectrum of things. It's an emotional reaction. It's manifested in many ways, not just emotionally. So the idea that it's just emotional is a myth. The idea that we go through stages and we slowly and predictably recover is also a myth. It has no defined timeline. It doesn't mean letting go of the person who died. We never really fully detach from those we love. It doesn't ever really end, but what happens is that we learn to live with the loss and integrate it. And it's not best done alone. I think our panel is going to share that with you this afternoon too, that people need opportunities to share their memories and hear their child's name and their loved one's name. Therese Rando is a well-known writer and researcher on the grief experience. And she points out that parental grief, which is the case for many of you, is by nature a complicated grief experience, and it cannot be evaluated by the traditional criteria. So when people talk to you, if you've lost a child and they say, oh yes, I remember when I lost my grandfather, it's like apples and oranges. There's absolutely no comparison to parental grief. And it's complicated by nature. It looks abnormal by nature, but it's not. The loss of a child is something that's just undescribable in traditional terms. These two folks also write a lot about bereaved parents. What they talk about is the idea of continuing bonds, that you're experiencing the opportunity to form a continuing bond with your child that looks different from the relationship that you have. And again, this idea that there's a beginning and an end instead of a renegotiation of meaning needs to be just put aside. I wanted to speak a moment about a couple of terms. Anticipatory grief is the idea that you are anticipating a loss, any type of loss, and it gives you an opportunity to work through unfinished business and resolve conflicts in preparation for potentially losing the person. But there's a lot of emotion and other aspects to deal with anticipatory losses because it involves a loss of control and a loss of a lot of things that can be very painful. Complicated grief is a term that people use a lot. And I would say, again, parental grief by definition is complicated grief. It does not mean the same thing as pathological grief. So if you have complicated grief, if you've lost someone very dear to you, that is not a diagnosis of something pathological that means that you have a psychiatric problem. It is by nature what happens when you lose a child. And it just means that people are going to be overwhelmed and have a prolonged and severe reaction. Those at highest risk, again, people who lose a child. And in the case of SUDEP, we know that sudden unexpected death of any type or traumatic death is also a risk for complicated grief. There are a number of other things here that can cause complicated grief, but again, not pathological. Other risk factors are people feeling as if they were not able to protect their child. And I'm guessing, just having spoken briefly with the panel, that some of you in the audience and on the panel have felt that too. Your role as a parent, your role as a caregiver is to be able to protect your child from bad things happening. And so by nature, not being able to do that violates your assumptions about not only your life and your child's life, but about your role as a caregiver, and can lead to intense feelings of guilt after the loss. Also recognize that parents will have different responses. Men and women grieve differently, brothers and sisters grieve differently, and that's normal. And people will have different times at which they process the grief and the information over time, and that needs to just be taken into account. I love the term memory embraces, but this is something that happens where you just unexpectedly something brings up a memory for you and you have the opportunity to embrace your child or your loved one through life. And while that can be wonderful, it can also be a little shattering depending on when it happens and how it happens. If you're at work and something happens, it may throw you off. So being able to take that into account and kind of work through that is part of the grief journey. Complicated grief reactions come in many forms, and I'm not going to go through these, but I will just briefly say that those who lose people in unexpected ways may experience what's called disenfranchised grief, where the grief cannot be openly acknowledged or socially sanctioned, and that can be more difficult and lead to complicated grief. Grief can also be delayed. You may not feel anything for the first year if you're completely in shock that your child died. That is perfectly normal. And so over time, you will learn to incorporate the grief responses into your healing. when I said that grief is not just emotional, I just want to mention that there are many common grief reactions. And I just put these slides here for reference, not going to go through them all, but I want to just point out to people that there are many things that happen to you when you're grieving. And most of these are normal. There can be physical reactions. There can be behavioral changes that happen to you. You can start having accidents and banging into things and becoming clumsy and wondering, why is this happening to me? That can be a grief response. There can be emotional and social responses, everything from being very sad and the normal things that you would expect to feeling completely numb, feeling betrayed, feeling some relief. All of those things are normal. There can be intellectual and cognitive changes that can happen as well. You can just sort of feel like you're living in a fog all the time. You can't believe that it happened, and you just can't pay attention to normal things. You can't read a book. You can't watch a TV show from beginning to end. That's normal. You may have flare-ups of your medical problems, and those can be expected or unexpected. And you're going to have maybe some spiritual questions and or distress. Some people describe that their faith was completely shaken. Some people describe that their faith became stronger, but most people describe that they ask questions about the experience to some degree. So what can we do? What can people do to intervene with this experience? Providing presence and listening, identifying people that can be supportive, acknowledging that people grieve differently, giving people the chance to share their stories, giving them the opportunities or yourselves the opportunities to create new rituals, new memories, and helping people say the name of their loved one out loud. That seems to be one of the most healing things that can be done. And in terms of parents who have lost children, I think sometimes just finding ways for them to integrate the memory of that child into a new and different life, and that being able to keep going and living and working with your other children and being able to stay married and hold down a job does not mean that you've forgotten your child. It simply means that you are integrating that experience and working toward healing. So these are just some suggestions that have come from grieving people to point us toward what can be helpful. And sometimes this has to be done alone, and sometimes a friend or family member or a loved one can help you through these opportunities. Support groups have been found to be really helpful, just finding connections with others in a similar situation. The timing of that can vary. We have people who come into our support groups and they find out it's too early, and then they come back a year later and it works for them. So, but just being able to be with a group of people who allow them to be themselves and hear others who have gone through this experience can be a safe environment and very healing. If you have brothers and sisters or siblings who have gone through the grief experience, these are some of the things that are helpful. And again, this is on the slide. I won't read all of them, but just to be able to keep kids in their normal routines and give them opportunities to remember their brothers and sisters and to be children is really helpful. Remember first and foremost that grief is a form of love. And so by accepting it and learning it to weave it into our lives instead of getting over something, we really are sharing our love of our loved one, even as we remake our lives without them. And I love this perspective because it just normalizes grief as something that is a normal reflection of a relationship that was important to us. And in order to do that, we need a supportive community, which we have today. And we're going to hear from our panel about how we can keep doing that. So I'll just leave you with these words from William Worden, who wrote them about the 4 tasks of mourning. Again, kind of accepting that the loss has happened, experiencing the pain, adjusting to the new environment, and then reinvesting in new relationships are the grief tasks that we face. There are a lot of resources out there, and I know that the websites that were mentioned and the organizations at the beginning have some, as well as your local children's hospitals. If you've lost a child, can be really helpful to help close that arc. And I just want to say one last thing, and that is one thing I've encountered with families is that children, when parents have lost a child, they've often found that the second year after is worse than the first year. They wake up out of a shock. You wake up, you realize your child is gone, and those anniversaries start coming and rolling. And most of the support that was there in the first year is not there anymore. So that's to be expected. And it's a thing for us as caregivers to remember that it doesn't stop at year 1. So be gentle with yourself and those you love. And last but not least, the most important thing to do is be present, say the child's name, and just keep showing up. Don't stay away and don't stay silent because you don't think you won't know what to do or say. So this is just in the slides you'll see, this was painted by a bereaved mom in memory of her 2 kids. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Friebert. And I wanted to turn it over to Dr. Buchhalter for his overview on the grief survey.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you all for joining us on this webinar. I would like to talk about, very briefly, something we're calling the grief survey. So we'll talk about why and how we did the survey. I'll present some of the preliminary results very briefly, and these are of several kinds. There's information about the people who answered the survey, information about the deceased, and the responses regarding the grief experience. The purpose of doing the survey was to learn from the bereaved about their grief process in order to provide information that could be helpful to those that participated in the survey and for others in similar situations. It's also to provide a starting point. And like any well-intentioned effort, you end up bringing up more issues than you've answered, more questions. And so this is a starting point for interventions to assist with the grief process associated with SUDEP and for future research as to how we can do it better. The survey was motivated by observations at different stages of grief at the Partners Against Mortality and Epilepsy conferences, which started almost a decade ago, have occurred every 2 years, and bring together those that are bereaved, clinical scientists, basic scientists, practitioners, and advocacy organizations. The observation was that there were similar expressions of grief at different times after SUDEP. And this seemed to evolve over time. The organizing group for the survey, as you see, I'm not going to read all the names, but those in italics were those who have been bereaved. The others of us are professionals working in the field. I wanted just to call out Dan Friedman, Dr. Friedman, for his facilitation of the project at NYU, and to Avni Kola, medical student, who did the data analysis. And a very special thanks to all those that responded to the survey, which you can imagine was not an easy experience. How did we do it? Well, it started in August of 2018 in bringing the organizing group together. This was followed by months of group calls, emails that created multiple drafts of the questions that were to be asked. And there were around 50 in the end. It then went through the NYU Grossman School of Medicine Institutional Review Board, as all research studies need to go through. And then a tool called Qualtrics was used as a survey tool, and this was online. The survey tool was sent to family members and caregivers who were bereaved, started in February of 2020, ended in May of 2020. The organizations that you see listed in the 2 bullets below use their membership lists via websites, email blasts, social media to send out the link to those folks. So thank you to all that facilitated this. The survey questions were of 2 types. The first, I just put around demographics. It's very important to know whenever you're doing any kind of survey or research study, who's answering, because there will be biases built into the results, and you just need to know about them up front. And I'll show you some of those. And then there were a number of questions that addressed exactly what their grief was like. The survey started with an introduction that described the purpose of the survey, as I mentioned to you, the acknowledgement of how difficult it is going to be to respond to the survey, the permission to stop at any point if it was just too darn painful, and reference to seek help with their grief. Because obviously, anytime you bring up something like this, there can be the waves crashing over people, as Dr. Friebert mentioned. The challenge in doing this kind of work is that there's a balance, because you want to know a lot, but you also know that with every added question or two, you're going to decrease the return of people being able to fill it out, just due to the length of it, and in this case, the pain of it. So some of the results. The total number of individual people that responded was 206. And to the best of our knowledge, this is probably the only and largest survey of this kind ever to be done in the domain of SUDEP. We certainly did not require answers to each question. But what that means, so it wasn't one of those things of, in order to go on to the next question, you have to answer this one. There weren't any of those. However, what that means is that the total number of responses to each question did not add up to the total amount of 206. And that some questions, there were multiple possible answers. So, which of these was relevant to you? And what that means is there may be a total number of answers that exceeds the number of people that answered the question. So that's just some of the nitty-gritty of how one does this kind of survey, and the limitations. The other thing to say is, and we spent a lot of time in that group discussing this, obviously it would be best to get everyone's responses to each question in their own words. The problem with that is it'd be extremely difficult to analyze and do a presentation. Dr. Ramachandran Nair will address some of the issues in qualitative research in the panel discussion. So here are some of the participant characteristics, folks that answered. And what I've tried to do is summarize the high points to make some comments. The first is that in the group of 18 to 24 years of age, there's only 1% of the respondents, which means we didn't hear a lot from young people, and you'll see what that means just shortly. The next group was 25 to 34 years of age. That was 5%. And so what we found was the majority of respondents were in the age group 35 to 74 years of age. In terms of gender, 76% were female, and 94% were white. And of course, what this obviously means, as Dr. Friebert said, is that many times we're hearing from the moms who have been bereaved, and we need to hear the voices, of course, of fathers and the male perspective. Obviously, this is a highly biased sample with regard to race, and so future efforts need to address the inclusiveness issue, and that is something to be done. Finally, with regard to geography, 93% were from the United States. Obviously, we need to recognize that there are different social and cultural perspectives from other countries. With regard to the relationship to the deceased, 77% were parents. And that will obviously influence the answers that we received. As Dr. Friebert so carefully mentioned, the complexity of that grief is different than others. Partners and spouses, 12%, siblings, 7%, and of course, there's a whole world of grief that the siblings go through and the PTSD that they live with that needs to be explored and developed with regard to interventions, and a small group of children of the deceased. Again, a different experience. In 77% of losses, the person responding was the primary caregiver. And that fits with the parental predominance of the respondents. With regard to those who passed away, and again, you'll see some of the smaller numbers here. This just means how many people responded to this question. Age at the time of death was 24 years of age, making the point that SUDEP occurs from the very young to the very old. No one is spared. Concordant with much of the literature, 68% of those that passed away were male. Age at seizure onset, approximately 17% were less than 5. 21 to 30% were 13%. So again, affecting the young. The type of seizures, most were convulsions, and we've been aware of that for a long time. But what's emerging now is a significant number have non-convulsive seizures. Number of medications at the time of death, almost 10% were not on medication. And this reflects partially the fact that many of the deaths occurred not long after the diagnosis of epilepsy. About half were on one medication, almost 20% were on 2 medications. With regard to comorbidities, it's important to point out that depression is a significant comorbidity because some of the premature mortality associated with SUDEP is due to suicide. Intellectual disability, 17%, indicating that the majority were neurotypical. And again, to make the point that half had no comorbidities. So many were healthy people who had one or more seizures. Only 10% lived alone. 65% lived with their families. The majority required some assistance related to their epilepsy, and 85% required care for basic functions, activities of daily living. In terms of the respondents, how long was it since the time of passing? 4% were in that particularly raw period, 6 months or less. 2 to 4 years, a little more than a third. 5 to 10 years, 27%, and notably, 10% were able to respond whose loved one had passed greater than 10 years ago. In terms of meeting with the provider, For those that answered that question, it occurred within 4 weeks in 88%, which I was surprised with really how good that was. During the police investigation, half believed that they were treated with compassion, which means that half did not feel that way. Majority believed they were treated with respect. With regard to the respondents, 70% had never heard of SUDEP before then, and 88% had wished that they had. Sort of a surprising result to me with regard to the question, do you wish the deceased had known about SUDEP? And the answer was not nearly as much as what they had wished for themselves. You know, almost 40% was unsure or did not wish their loved one had known about it. Then a number of questions about the grief process. And all of these were compared to 3 months after death in these time periods. And I just highlighted the ones where there was improvement, getting better, 20% or more over time. And again, you will see all this once the paper is published. The physical, mental health status got better and work got better after the shock of the first 3 months was over. People grew closer to their spouses and partners. And I'm not going to read these to you for the sake of time, but this was hopeful. In the majority of instances, things did get better. What I'd like to point out down here is there was no significant change in divorce rate. And there's a lot of discussion about how SUDEP and premature mortality increases the frequency of divorce. And we didn't really see evidence of that in this study. How did SUDEP affect them? And the answer was it affected almost 70%. How did it affect them? It increased guilt in almost 60%, or regret. It provided answers only in half, and there were a lot of questions still remaining. There was a lot of anger and frustration about not having been told earlier. What did folks say could be done to help? And again, I think a lot of this is obvious, but I just wanted to highlight the importance, as Dr. Friebert said, about being able to talk about it with people who understood the loss, the listening ear of family and friends. And things like working to prevent this from happening in the future, and a variety of other places where intervention was found to be helpful. What were their recommendations to professionals? Offer condolences. Answer questions were at the top of the list. Recommendations for advocacy groups. And again, it was listening, answering questions, and providing information. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and thank you to all that participated in the survey. We know it wasn't easy.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a big effort, and we appreciate you pulling all that together in a meaningful way. Now we're going to move on to our panel discussion, and I'd like to briefly introduce our panel members. We have Edana Perry, Sally Schaffer, Michael Schaffer, no relation, as well as Dr. Rajesh Ramachandran Nair. Edana, can you start us off by telling us about your daughter Kayla's story? I think you're on mute, Edana.
All right, let's try it again. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edana Perry, and I do appreciate being able to be here, and I thank the PAME team for allowing us to be a part and share our story. Me and my husband, Bernard, were blessed with 3 children. Their names are Taylor, Christian, and Kayla. And I'm here representing our youngest daughter, Kayla Ross Perry, who cannot be here today. Our Kayla passed away unexpectedly from SUDEP at the vivacious and vibrant age of 26 years old, actually on me and my husband's wedding day in 2017. After her diagnosis of juvenile myoclonic epilepsy at the age of 11, we lived every day to the fullest with the reality that Kayla could have a seizure, fall down, and hit her head and possibly pass away. But as a family, we willingly adapted to a lifestyle to support Kayla so that she could have as much of a normal life as possible. We experienced a healthy partnership with both our pediatric and adult neurological providers who would recommend new medications, provided us with pamphlets on living with epilepsy as a teenager or as a young adult. However, we were not provided information about SUDEP. So our grief experience included some of what our previous panel discussed about the what ifs and how could we not have known. But I'm here today to let you know that information should be shared with families, and that I feel that it should be left up to the families to handle and process that in terms of whether they want to actually understand it or believe it. But I'm also here today to let you know that even with the pain and the hurt that I've experienced, that my faith tells me that everything there is a season and a time and a purpose. And as I think about that, I realize that we are choosing to share Kayla's light and our epilepsy experiences as a way to help others live with epilepsy. And so today, again, I'm here representing Kayla to help. Thank you.
Thanks, Edana. And Sally, could you tell us about Lydia?
Sure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for being here today. My name is Sally Schaffer, and as some of you might know, I used to work for the Epilepsy Foundation and the SUDEP Institute, bringing in awareness, education, and supporting the bereaved from death from epilepsy. If you are familiar with my story, I'm sorry for repeating it. And I say story, but it really is a journey. I lost Lydia on Mother's Day, 2014. She had a rare nocturnal epilepsy called electrical status epilepticus in sleep. She was a special needs child. She had a rare chromosome disorder, so she had many health challenges, and epilepsy was one that reared its ugly head when she was 1.5 years. And again, she died at the age of 7. So I have done many presentations like this and spoken on behalf of those who have lost and in memory of my daughter. Unfortunately, we knew about SUDEP, but I don't think knowing about it makes it any easier in losing someone you love, especially your child. And so I'm here to share my passage in grief as it has changed and morphed in almost 7 years that she's been gone. 7 years that she was on this earth. She is gone almost just as long. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sally. And Michael, we turn to you to learn about Cameron.
My name is Michael Schaffer. I am a retired physician, and my stepson Cameron was 37 years old, almost, short a month. When he died of SUDEP, he had had epilepsy for 20 years, diagnosed when he was 16. But in contrast to many, he had only perhaps half a dozen seizures his whole adult life. And he seemed normal in every other way. So we were totally shocked when he didn't awaken one morning. It's 11 years ago now. And in keeping with the theme of this webinar, I'm going to talk mostly about the grief that we experienced, which was, as you might expect, and all of us have shared, was just a total shock. He was the picture of good health. And so part of our loss was just the shock of having a young, strapping, successful young man in our midst one day and then totally gone the next day. So grief has, as we've talked about already in this hour, so many different faces and so many different qualities, but one of them is the surprise factor. I was out of the country on a surgical mission when Cameron died, and Ellen, my partner, finally reached me 24 hours, within the first 24 hours, and I was able to come home quickly. And one of the things that I did that might be helpful to some people who are still dealing with this is that on the way home, I started writing a eulogy for Cameron that I knew that I would have the opportunity to give at his memorial service. And I really think that helped, because during that process, I began to put together some of the wonderfully crazy and humorous things about him and his life and his character. So that was just kind of one of the early steps that I took that I think was really helpful. The other is that I just wanted to put out there for thinking is that people want to be included in the sharing of grief. And so don't be ashamed or afraid to ask people for help, or let people in to share your loss with you, because people who love you really want to do that. And I think you'll find that it really is rewarding. So it does get better with time. There is life beyond this. It's different, and it always will be. One message I would like to give is that don't resist the grief. Accept it. Accept it as part of your new way of life. It will get better, and reasonably quickly, the tears of loss will become tears of joy of just having had that person in your life. So thank you for asking me to be part of this and share this little bit of Cameron's life. And the fact, I think it was Dr. Friebert brought up, that grief really is it's a form of love. And the more you can share that with other people and let them into your life, the more that you will be rewarded for that, and your grief will become much more bearable. Thank you.
Rajesh, I just wanted to touch base with you and ask if what you've heard so far has aligned with some of the themes you've seen over the years in your research, or any commentary you might have.
Absolutely, because this is the first time. First of all, thank you for including me in the panel. And this is the first time I am hearing the preliminary results from Dr. Buchhalter. So thank you, Jeff, for sharing those results. On many of those aspects, we have published on the qualitative aspects. And in our publication, we always mention this should be validated by a large survey, consecutive survey. So I am quite satisfied to know that some of the findings from the qualitative research has been validated, especially regarding the initial reactions felt by the bereaved families. But one thing that struck me very strong is I heard from Edana as well as Michael that they did not know about the term SUDEP before the death of their loved ones. And in my study, the participants expressed intense anger as well as regret that their loved ones or they were not informed about SUDEP. I'm not an expert in the grief process, but my question to Dr. Friebert is, when there is a component of anger, as well as regret, how does it really affect the grief process? I think I'm not entirely sure whether the trajectory will be slightly different. And I'm quite curious to know about that, because I'm not sure whether anybody has really studied about that aspect in detail.
I'm not sure about the research answer to that question. I'd share with you, and maybe the panel could answer this too, that anger is just another form of an expression of the strength of the relationship. And I know, I've had people say that they're angry at God, for example, and I've heard chaplains and other clergy people respond that that's an expression of a relationship with God that still exists. And so the anger may show up as a different type of emotion, and certainly it can feel more destructive and be more destructive, but it needs its outlets and it needs its way of dealing with it. But I'm not sure that it changes wholeheartedly the entire arc of grief. It's just a different manifestation. I think we'd have to study that individually, but I think for people that are angry or guilty or frustrated or numb, I think the journey is still the journey. It just shows up in different ways.
Thank you.
Edana, I remember you mentioned to me that after Kayla died, part of your grief involved confusion. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, as parents, I think we, as parents, we teach our children, well, we want to protect our children. And so we try all we can when they're growing up to move the chairs out when they're walking, and we put things on the doors so that they don't get in to things that they shouldn't. And as a parent of a child who had epilepsy, I prided myself on thinking I knew everything about her disease. I had a folder this big, and I could tell you all the things that was going on. But when we found out unexpectedly that Kayla passed from this illness called SUDEP, I was confused. My husband and I were confused. We, in our minds, were like, well, we could fathom and process the fact that she might fall and hit her head, but we were confused about why we did not know about this. And it added to our grief. It added to our grief that there was something that we were not aware of, because as her parents, we are there to try to minimize risk. And so the confusion was just that, how could we not have known? And so what, we had to do was to slowly process, and going back to some of what the experts are saying, that, it added to our grief because you have some regrets. So that was part of my confusion, that I just didn't understand. Not that I would have understood even better or easier that my child would have a seizure and fall down and die, but how could she fall asleep, have a seizure, and die? That was just something that was not shared with me.
Thanks, Edana. Michael, I wanted to ask you, among our panel, you've been coping or living with the loss for the longest period of time. And I wanted to ask if you and Ellen could contrast the grief that you've experienced from 2009 to today, how it's different, or maybe in some ways the same.
Well, thank you, Tom. I think that really is an important question. It's significantly different. In the early days following Cameron's death, Ellen was introduced to somebody new, and that person asked Ellen if she had any children. And Ellen said no, she didn't, and left it at that. And that night in her sleep, Cameron came to her in a dream and said, "Mom, you have a child. I'm still here. You just can't see me. And that really struck home. And in the first several years, we could hardly mention his name without, I cry almost as easily as my three sisters. I've got a feminine streak in me that leads toward that, I think. And Ellen is marshmallow on the inside, on the outside, and titanium steel on the inside. So at the mention of Cameron's name, she would cry for the very first 3 or 4 or 5 years. But she was so strong. She had this great sense of peace that Cameron had done what he had come to do in this lifetime. He had lived a life in his 36 years so full, more than other people twice those years. So a sense of faith and a sense of kind of believing in that arc of justice that we talk about, we came to feel like at some peace with Cameron had fulfilled his mission and that it was all right. And that sounds a little philosophic, but it helped us through very much in accepting our loss and the grieving. The other thing is that we had a number of friends who just were with us. They just came to be kind of allies. They didn't even really have to say anything, but they kind of were there and cleaned up the dishes when a few people had been in the house. And one couple brought a case of wine and just tucked it in the corner when somebody needed a little something to sip on. And others who were just kind of there, but were just kind of present, didn't necessarily have to say things. And that got easier. And over the time now, we have become friends with other friends of Cameron's, and we call them his gift to us. But our grief now is considerably different. It is much more joyous. It's much more accepted. Our loss is more accepted. And it may sound a little shallow to those whose grief whose loss is acute. And I see there's some people on who very recently lost some people, but it does get better. And I think that's part of the grieving process. If you let it take its course, you have to let it in, don't push it away. And it's very different now than it was 11 years ago. The loss is still there. And Erich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian, said that loss of a loved one is a hole in your life. It's a hole in your heart that will always be there. But that's as it should be, because that's where your grief abides, in that hole in your life. And so don't try to close it with other things. Just accept that it's there, learn to live with it, and then just be grateful for what you've had. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, well, that's very valuable. Sally, I know you've talked about the fact that no two losses are the same, and that there's such a difference in grieving for the parent or the sibling or the grandparent. Can you share some of your experiences in that regard from your role at the Epilepsy Foundation?
Oh, absolutely. I look at my daughter being 7, and I mean, I've even said it with my husband, where there's been somebody that has lost a child that's 21 years old. And I've said, gosh, I can't even imagine. And people have looked at me really strangely and said, well, what do you mean? You've lost a child? And I said, yes, but my 7-year-old special needs child who didn't talk, who was diapered, who I had to help with all of her activities of daily living is different than a 21-year-old who had maybe a fiance or a college graduation coming up. So even though the loss of the child is the same, no two losses are the same, right? Versus a newborn or a 3-year-old or whatnot, whatever that situation is. So we can't always say it's apples to apples. That loss of a child is the same. And even with siblings, I mean, I immediately, when Lydia died, I immediately went towards my boys to figure out how to help them. And my thought always was, if it hurts so bad for me, how can I expect my children? I can't even comprehend this loss. I can't, in my mind, say, why did this happen? Why did I lose my child? So I know that people say children are resilient, but I think I'm an adult with mature thinking. How can I expect my children to understand and comprehend this? And so I put them in therapy right away and tried to make sure they knew we were there to listen. It was very, very hard. My 11-year-old or 12-year-old, as he grew, he was 9 when she died, but he struggled emotionally. And we were in therapy one time, and I asked the therapist, I said, is this trauma from the passing? And he said, no, I don't think it's trauma. And I said to my son, my eyes started to tear up, and I said, why won't you talk about her? And he yelled back, he said, because of this. Look at you. This is what you do. And he didn't like the pain. And so when you look, even as in the Suit Up Institute, I talked with many individuals who had siblings that had passed, and some of those relationships were so close and so tight. I know one woman, Danielle, you listen to her talk about her brother, and it's just amazing, that close relationship. And so grief isn't the same, even if that relationship was the same. So we have to be cognizant in that, and we have to recognize that, and we have to give grace to each other. And I think for the grieving, we've woken up to that, right? We know that already now, and we go, wow, there was things that we probably should have said differently. But I take it on as, now I'm going to educate people around me about grief and how to deal with it, because it's most uncomfortable for those that aren't affected. So how can I help educate, and how can I help bring light to the different sources, the different kinds of grief, and how to react to them?
Thank you, Sally. And I know we're up against time, but I just wanted to ask one final question to Dr. Friebert. If you were to just lay out, 1 or 2 or 3 suggestions, and I know this is difficult to ask, but just how you can help another person with their grief or be there for them, some simple takeaways would be great.
I think the panelists have said it all, but I'll say it again. Just keep showing up. Don't walk away just because you can't think of what to say. Say the child's name. Remember the child's birthday. Check in with people on Mother's Day, on Father's Day, on the anniversary of the death, on holidays, on those tough times. And don't forget that years 2, 3, 4, 5, and even 11, as we've heard, that pain doesn't go anywhere. Their life doesn't move on. I think each panelist could probably write a book on the stupid things that have been said to them after their child died. And so try not to say those things. But having said that, sometimes people are so afraid of saying stupid things that they don't say anything at all. And I think that's worse. And just show up, say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. I love you. I loved Aaron. I loved Kenny. I loved all the people that we heard about on this webinar today. I loved him. I loved her. I love you. Let me help. And I think for people who are going through the grief journey, if you can try to, as others have said, it's hard to watch. So if you can try to let others know how they can help and what's not helpful, then people won't hurt you, and they will help you, and they'll feel better because they can help you. So it's that mutual connection and just sticking with it.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice. Well, I want to thank all our speakers for taking part and sharing in such a personal way. I know this has been tremendously informative to me, and I hope in some ways therapeutic for the speakers and the audience. I want to turn it over to Jeff to wrap up and have some final thoughts.
Thanks, and thanks to everyone. Like the almost 100 people that are participating in this webinar, I think we all feel like there just wasn't enough time, and there's never enough time. So please complete the short evaluation that'll appear at the end of the webinar. It'll open up in your browser. It's really important, obviously, to let us know what we did right, what we could do better, and if there's any additional feedback you have, please share it with the address that you see on your screen. And just know that this is an ongoing effort. There's going to be more webinars, and there are going to be future PAME meetings that we hope you'll all participate and contribute to in your own way. So thank you very, very much.